Thank you so much for that introduction and also the invitation to speak today as part of PCMA's Heritage Month. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm giving this talk is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So having seen the exponential increase in the deployment of digital technologies in archaeology, whether it be in the museum, for example, maybe we're having photogrammetry models that's sometimes used for repatriation here in North America to indigenous groups. In the field, meaning as part of excavation, so using like digital tablets, laser scanning is becoming very prominent as well, and in conservation. So maybe some virtual reality kind of recreations of sites. There was a need to critically examine the usage of digital technologies as a conservation strategy based on actual data. I was particularly interested in these interventions in the context of negative heritage. So, what is negative heritage? Negative heritage is a term first coined by Lynn Maskell, and it refers to places of conflict that become associated with a negative memory in the collective, so in like the group consciousness. These places are associated with legacies of violence, and violence could have created these sites, or they could have been existing already and then they're transformed by violence. So some examples of negative heritage include, you can see here on the screen, Hiroshima, which of course was devastated by the atomic bomb during World War II. An example from Canada would be these residential schools, which were schools where Indigenous children were forcibly taken. So they were forcibly removed from their families, taken to these schools where they were indoctrinated under a program of assimilation to remove their Indigenous culture from them. And there was often a lot of abuse going on. Sometimes death as well occurred. And some other well-known examples from around the world, of course, include Auschwitz, the bombing on Buddhas, and the killing fields in Cambodia. The overarching questions that the project I'm going to talk about today include: what is the role of digital technologies in the conservation of cultural heritage sites destroyed by armed conflict? How do these kinds of conservation tools, meaning using digital technologies, how do they perform cultural diplomacy? And lastly, what memories do they elicit? We're asking these questions in this research project because we want to gain a better understanding on how digital technologies are received by different groups and communities. Using the data, we can identify beneficiaries of these kind of digital interventions and then use the data to shape future policies for their deployment. In order to examine these issues, the Triumphal Arch of Palmyra was chosen as a case study because it's a relatively high-profile site in terms of the archaeological world, but also internationally. So in terms of international diplomacy, and then also public awareness. So just some background on Palmyra. This is an archaeological site, also known as Tadmor. So we're referring to the ancient site, not to be confused with a modern city, which is nearby, which has the same name. And it's located northeast of Damascus. Um, it is commonly known as Palmyra in the Western world. In this talk, I'm going to refer to it using its native Syrian name, just to keep with the local community's terminology. It was very important because it was at the crossroads of Persia, India, China, and the Roman Empire. And its architecture therefore reflects a blend of different cultures, including Greco-Roman and Persian Parthian cultures. It spans multiple time periods and cultures, so there were multiple occupations at the site, going back to the prehistoric, so in the Neolithic period, circa 7500 BCE, Then we also have Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, Hellenistic, and Ottoman periods, as well as the Palmyrene Empire, which was its own kind of empire. Throughout time, it has faced both natural and human-caused destruction. This conflict-driven destruction has occurred through to the present period, so the modern era. And this map is from ASOR, also known as the American Society of Overseas Research. So this map is from 2016, and it documents different destructive forces at the site. So, for instance, here you can see looting, which is this kind of like teal dots. So you can see down here at the bottom right of the map, there was some looting occurring here near the Southeast Necropolis. Also, military activity being explosives with this blue kind of dots here. And then military occupation. So the site was used as a base for military operations, which you can see with the yellow dots. And then finally, what's especially of interest are these red dots, which are indicating intentional destruction. And when they refer to intentional destruction, what they mean for this particular site of Tadmor is that Daesh, which we also know as Islamic State, targeted the site in 2015 with numerous bombings. So you can see here, there was some bombings at the Western Necropolis, the Valley of the Tombs, the Triumphal Arch, which is of our interest, Temple of Bel, etc., etc. So due to the level of violence that occurred at the site, Tadmor can be considered an example of negative heritage. After the destruction of Tadmor by Daesh, there were several organizations who were interested in using digital technologies as a way to conserve the heritage of the site. Perhaps the most widely publicized case in mass media, so not just in academic circles, but in the media worldwide. So, for example, BBC, The Guardian, the Canadian Broadcasting Channel carried it, New York Times, etc. Um, was the intervention by the Institute for Digital Archaeology, also known as the IDA. So the IDA, who are they? Basically, it's a consortium consisting of a partnership of people from Oxford University, Harvard University, and the Dubai Future Foundation. The Dubai Future Foundation is basically a museum, so that's government funded. And they kind of came together and they formed the IDA and they designated the triumphal arch as kind of like the symbol, the icon, the proxy to stand for the site of Tadmor. The IDA claimed to have effectively crowdsourced approximately 300 photos, which were from pre-destruction, so before Daesh had actually targeted the Triumphal Arch and destroyed it. They then used these photos to create a 3D model of the arch, which you can see here on the screen. And Tor Art, which is an Italian art studio, then took the model to CNC or computer numerical control, basically robot mill, a massive replica of the Triumphal Arch from Tadmor. So the massive replica is not quite to scale to what the original was, but it's still very, very large, as you'll see in subsequent slides. So it still was, 26,000 pounds. So it was still massive. And this replica, which they CNC milled, or basically, 3D printed, although they milled it out of marble instead of what we think of with the resin for 3D printers, was unveiled in Trafalgar Square in London, England in 2016. The arch then continued to tour around the world on exhibition in various cities, including New York, DC, Geneva, Arona, and Dubai. And then its last known location was in Luxembourg in 2020. Meanwhile, in 2018, a museum in England called the Victoria and Albert Museum, or V&A for short, asked the IDA for a much smaller replica to permanently display in their cast courts galleries. So the case study of Tadmor and the Triumphal Arch involves multiple groups with vested interests. So this includes the IDA itself to UNESCO. UNESCO originally was very hesitant about endorsing this model that was created, but they did end up co-signing the IDA's Triumphal Arch in the end. Of course, we have the public, museum and conservation professionals, archaeologists, and last but not least, the local community and the Syrian people at large. Rather than focus on authenticity or technical proficiency, which are often critiqued when we talk about digital interventions, digital replicas, digital models, um, this project is interested in the social facets of the Triumphal Arch's reconstruction in digital form and the perspectives of the different groups involved. So when we're talking about these different perspectives and these different groups or stakeholders, the research really honed in on three different groups. The first group was the Syrian diaspora community. So we conducted interviews with this community in Canada because we were not able to travel to Syria at the time, given the war and sanctions. Obviously, now things have shifted a little, although it still is a little bit difficult. I don't know that in terms of like university institutional liability and risk management that they would allow that to occur. But we definitely were not able to travel to Syria, which would have been our preference, to obviously go to the country of origin and do the interviews there. Our second group that we were looking at was the general public. So the general public was represented by data collected from visitors to the V&A Museum in London. So remembering that that's the museum where a second replica by the IDA is on exhibition, although it is much, much smaller. Um, and so we did a couple of different modes of data collection there, which I'll talk about later. And then we had some feedback in the form of comment cards from public workshops held in Canada. And those public workshops were attended by 74 different individuals. They occurred in two different locations. And this included the public as well as members of the Syrian diaspora community. So it was kind of a mix. Um, and finally, we did conduct some interviews with experts in museums and international diplomacy. In this talk, I'm primarily going to discuss the perspective shared with us by the first two groups, the Syrian diaspora community, as well as the general public, as represented by the V&A sample. And here on this slide, you can see a photograph that I took of the Cast Courts Gallery at the V&A Museum. Again, this is the museum in London where the smaller replica arch is located. So you can get a kind of sense of the gallery there and the other kind of objects that are held in that same kind of location. Interviews with the Syrian diaspora community members lasted between 1.5 to 3 hours long, and it covered general questions about heritage as well as some more focused questions on Tadmor and the Triumphal Arch. So we conducted 37 interviews. These were in-person interviews. We chose to conduct them in person rather than online because this is a bit of a sensitive topic. Also, we wanted to protect the privacy of the people involved, and we felt that people might be a little bit nervous if they were, you know, on a digital platform that maybe could be hacked or, maybe nervous about being video recorded. We did ask for permission to audio record the interviews, which almost everyone gave permission to. but those interviews are only heard by the researchers themselves and transcribed by the researchers. So the in-person interviews took place in Metro Vancouver, which is kind of the greater Vancouver area, as well as the Okanagan in British Columbia, which is in the interior of British Columbia. The reason the interviews took place in those two locations was because that's where the research team members were located and physically able to do the interviews. Participants were given the option of selecting a pseudonym of their choice or to be named in the study. Uh, the interviews were conducted in two languages. Again, it was up to the participant which language they preferred. We had it in English as well as Arabic. The background of the participants was quite diverse. So, in terms of the occupation, in terms of where in Syria they were from, as well as the time in Canada and the age range. So, it was quite a spectrum. Many of our participants were refugees, but of course, you can see here we also had a lot of participants who had immigrated to Canada a long time ago, with our longest time spent in Canada being 22 years. An almost even number self-identified as males and females, so it was practically an even split. Of course, it was 37 total participants, so of course it's an uneven total number to begin with. And then you can see in terms of the age range that it does skew a little bit towards the younger end of things. And so we do have a little bit of a skew between 19 to 34 years of age. In order to understand the sentiments of the general public, myself and a graduate student research assistant, Jordana Marshall, conducted 300 surveys in the cast courts. Again, that's the gallery where the smaller triumphal arch replica um, is on display. So the cast courts is a gallery entirely consisting of replica objects, although many visitors were unaware of this fact. The survey comprised 36 questions of various formats, including open-ended, multiple choice, and ranked choice questions. Although it was designed and could be completed in under 10 minutes, so as little as 5 minutes to 10 minutes was the estimated completion time for the surveys. We actually found that many of the museum visitors took it very seriously, and we had several who took over 20 minutes to complete it, especially when it came to the open-ended questions where they were just able to enter free text. We engaged visitors from a wide spectrum of nationalities. So we had 42 different nationalities. Visitors self-identified their nationality. And the survey was available in English, as well as the 8 most commonly spoken visitor languages based on data that was provided to us by the V&A Museum. So the 8 most commonly spoken languages other than English were Chinese, French, German, Italian, Polish, Spanish, Japanese, and Korean. As you can see here, so this chart on the left is showing the age range. The age range for the public ended up being very similar to that of the Syrian diaspora group. Again, it is skewing more to the younger end of things here. So again, it's skewing more to the 34 years of age. But then when we look at the gender, this was self-identified by the survey respondents. And again, these categories are a little bit different than what we had for the Syrian diaspora group, because these categories were the categories that the museum preferred to use, as they wanted some of this data to kind of be aligned with their data collection strategy. So when it came to the V&A, the gender did skew 20% more towards self-identified women and girls rather than men and boys. In terms of nationality, the top nationality that we surveyed was British. That was just over 20% of the sample size, followed by American, which was around 7%, and Canadian, which was around 6%. As a sort of baseline for the study, we want to establish whether participants had any pre-existing knowledge of Tadmor and its destruction by Daesh. So when it came to the Syrian diaspora group, 91.8%, so the vast majority of the Syrian group told us they were aware, compared to only 44.3% of museum visitors surveyed. Okay, so there's definitely a discrepancy of awareness about the destruction of the site. Um, Around 40% of the Syrian diaspora participants had actually visited the archaeological site itself in person at least once. Most often, this was when they were a child. So we heard a lot of talk about going to the site, on a school field trip or with their family on a vacation, or also a kind of recreational field trips like with a club or, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, that kind of a club. And almost the same percentage of Syrian diaspora participants told us that they learned about Tadmor in school and that it was part of the school curriculum. And this included participants who went to both private and public schools. According to the IDA, the replica arches function to bring attention to the war in Syria, as well as to the need to preserve cultural heritage under threat, and acted as a statement of defiance to Daesh. So, Roger and Michelle in 2015 told the Smithsonian Museum that the reconstruction is really a political statement, a call to action to draw attention to what is happening in Syria and Iraq and now Libya. We are saying to them, if you destroy something, we can rebuild it again. So this quote was given before the arch actually appeared at its first site on display, which you can see here again. The first place it was exhibited around the world was in Trafalgar Square in London. So here you can see the scale of the replica arch. And of course, Boris Johnson was there for the exhibition. The IDA would also later go on to vow that they would actually erect this arch here um, as a replacement for the original one, which had been destroyed by Daesh at the site of Tadmor upon the end of the Syrian war. So that hasn't happened yet, even though obviously the war has ended. So that's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind. In order to be effective at accomplishing what the IDA claimed, people needed to have, at minimum, an awareness of the reconstructed arches. So, from the Syrian diaspora group, 21.7% or 8 individuals were aware of the large triumphal arch, which we just saw in the previous slide. However, zero, so no one from the Syrian diaspora group were aware of this little replica at the V&A. So here you can see the small one. You can see it's much smaller. Here's a person just for scale. So, this is the one that's permanently on exhibit in the museum. These results were in contrast with the museum sample representing the public. As the museum sample was taken in London, the first and most highly publicized place of exhibition of the larger IDA triumphal arch, we asked the visitors if they had seen the large IDA arch in person. 8 people indicated that they had seen it in person while it was on tour. That 8 represents 2.7% of survey respondents. Again, remembering our total respondent count was 300. One person said that they did see it at Trafalgar Square in London. 3 people said that they saw it in the USA, and 2 people did not give a specific location where they saw it. The remaining locations specified were China and Malaysia. However, we know it never went to either China or Malaysia. So if we remove these 2 outliers, only 2% of the museum visitors had ever seen the large triumphal arch on tour. When it came to the smaller V&A arch, 32% of museum visitors told us they were aware of it. From the public feedback workshops, again, those took place in Canada, less than 7% of participants at those workshops knew about the replica arches. In addition to the surveys of museum visitors, we recorded naturalistic observations in the cast courts at the V&A. So, naturalistic observations allow for an unbiased glimpse into human behavior, as subjects are unaware and thus not influenced by the presence of researchers. So, this was a little bit different than the research that the V&A had previously conducted on their own for their own purposes and their own research questions. We know that the V&A previously had done some research and gathered visitor feedback using escorted visits, where they basically had a museum staff member accompanying a group while they went through the museum. And we just didn't want to do that because we wanted to have an unbiased understanding and we didn't want to influence what the visitors were looking at and what they were engaging with. So these naturalistic observations comprised random sampling every hour we were present at the museum. The observations took two forms. So firstly, we had some instantaneous sampling. This was done over 7 consecutive days from Saturday to Friday. And so at each hour, at a random pre-selected time, which we determined by running a code in the R statistics program, the total number of visitors in the cast courts gallery was recorded, as well as the number of visitors who are physically located in front of the replicating the past wall. So here you can see an image of the replicating the past wall, and you can clearly see that this is the wall where the small IDA arch replica is on display, which you can see right here to the right. So when we did this instantaneous sampling, we counted a total of 3,763 visitors, and only 0.004% or 15 visitors were observed physically being at the wall. Again, this is only physically being at the wall, so we don't know if they actually, were looking or seeking out this particular object, being the triumphal arch replica, or, it could have been any of these things here, right? Like these little models, frizz, whatever. The second part of the naturalistic observations were focus follows. So we conducted focus follows of 51 different individuals, similar to the instantaneous sampling. Each hour at a random pre-selected time, we recorded all the exhibits that a specific individual engaged with for their entirety of the time spent in the cast courts gallery. So this was basically from the moment the visitor entered this gallery. There were two entrances, so we alternated which entrance we took the next person at the predetermined time, to all the way their whole journey throughout the cast courts, and then when they eventually exited the gallery. These observations took place over 8 days from Saturday to Friday, plus an additional Monday. And we recorded a total of 817 engagements across 213 different exhibits. And this table here is just comparing frequencies or counts for engagements between the top 4 exhibits. So the top 4 engaged with exhibits were Trajan's Column, which you can see a photograph here on the right of. Second was a replica of Michelangelo's David. And then we had tied for third place Giovanni Pisano's Pulpit. And then there was a display, which was essentially an overview of the cast courts gallery and explaining kind of the genesis of it and the purpose of it and the kind of objects you would see. At no point, so we have a frequency of 0, did we observe any of the randomly selected individuals for our focus falls engage with the V&A replica arch. And I just want to note too that these objects here that are in the top 4 are much larger. So clearly you can see this object here, the Trajan's Column, it's multiple stories in size. It's much larger than that little replica arch that was on the replicating the past wall. So there is, a hypothesis that that could have some, could have been a factor. Based on the data collected, ultimately, the V&A arch has low visibility and garners little interest amongst visitors in the museum. A theme that came up several times in interviews with Syrian participants was a feeling of their heritage being stolen by outsiders. Many participants were highly suspicious of the continuous parade of politicians posing for photo ops with the triumphal arch. Some found it highly distressing. So, for example, Donya here said, "You feel like your history is being stolen." 18.9% of Syrian diaspora participants considered the replicas to be acts of theft. And Madden here said, "It does not make them," meaning the IDA or the creators of these replica arches, "any different than Daesh. Daesh destroyed it and they stole it." The idea that heritage could be stolen and or appropriated was echoed at the public workshops by both Syrians and non-Syrians. In the same vein, museum visitors were asked, whose cultural heritage does the Triumphal Arch belong to? 243 respondents provided 278 responses to this questions. So on the surveys, visitors were able to skip any questions that they did not want to answer for whatever reason. Maybe they felt uncomfortable, maybe they just didn't want to answer it. And for this particular question, respondents had the ability to name more than one group or community, which is why we had 278 responses from 243 different visitors. The number one answer given was Syria or the country of origin, and the second most frequent group named was everyone. So basically this idea, that heritage is belonging to all of humanity, that is universally owned. It's all of our heritage. Interestingly, the creators or producers of the object were only mentioned 5 times, and America was mentioned 4 times. Again, they were able to give whatever group they wanted. It was a free text question. The data also revealed divergences on opinions between the Triumphal Arch and the V&A Arch. Size but also context matter. Many Syrian diaspora participants preferred the V&A Arch, the smaller one, due to its inability to be mistaken for the real arch. So because of its size, it's so small, there's no way anyone could think it was actually the real object itself, the original one. They also found the museum to be less offensive and a more educational environment. They were less suspicious of the museum and kind of the motivations between the museum having this arch and having it on display. At the same time, they found it ineffective in drawing attention to Syria and Syrian cultural heritage because of its small size. So it's not something that would be easily noticeable. Museum visitors and Syrian diaspora participants alike commented that the V&A Arch was one small object amongst a sea of giants. Again, Trajan's Column, Michelangelo's David were much bigger objects in that same gallery space. In some instances, survey respondents even asked us, the research team, to show them where the arch was displayed in the cast courts because they had just not noticed it at all. And now that it had come to their attention through the survey, they were interested in seeing it. Conversely, many participants found that the grandeur of the large triumphal arch was more successful at conveying both the value and the likeness of the original arch, though they expressed reservations about the context of its display. So they liked that it was more visible, that it was kind of something that drew attention just because of its size. They did consider it, again, because of its size, to be more closer in physicality to the original object. But they also thought, because it wasn't in like a museum or university institution and space, that there were maybe some suspect motivations behind it. Being that the triumphal arch represents the Roman Empire, a Western culture, we asked if this was also the culture that Syrians viewed as representative of Tadmor. Queen Zenobia, so here's an illustration of Queen Zenobia here on the right, was mentioned 19 times by diaspora participants as the representative culture of Tadmor, while the Roman Empire was mentioned 13 times in interviews. Queen Zenobia was the ruler of the Palmyrene Empire from 267 to 272 CE. She conquered many of Rome's eastern provinces, including all of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia. She led Palmyra to become a major center for arts and culture. Although there is much overlap between Queen Zenobia and the Romans, our participants made a distinction between the two. They recounted to us how Queen Zenobia was a revered heroine in Syrian history and also very much a part of the Syrian identity, enmeshed in the national consciousness, even appearing on modern currency. When it came to the topic of rebuilding Tadmor, timing was a factor. 75.6% of Syrian diaspora participants found it problematic to spend large quantities of money on the creation of the Triumphal Arch, given the suffering of people in Syria during and after the war. Basic needs and infrastructure were cited as more pressing and necessary expenses. Though a couple of our participants believe that funding these areas would not have been viable during Daesh's occupation. As Nada told us, to restore Syria right now, we need specifically a post-war consciousness because the war has, not just destroyed the human body, but it also destroyed the human self and human memory, humanity's identification of the self. Participants were divided on the subject of rebuilding Tadmor after destruction. 32 said it was desired, 3 considered it undesirable, and 2 had mixed feelings. An additional 2 Syrians from the public workshops deemed it undesirable. As Yasmin said, reconstruction of Palmyra would not make sense to me personally because there's a beauty with knowing people built this without the physics and the math that we have today, and the construction material and the machinery and all that. The beauty is within the hands that created it. Of those who indicated it was undesirable or who had mixed feelings, participants expressed concerns about the intentions of the individuals rebuilding the site. Again, echoing Yasmin's thoughts, they believe that the original was irreplaceable, particularly in regard to its intangible qualities. So, for example, Wall remarked that the smell and touch of the stones could never be replicated, and that the arch had lost its identity. Hala told us that any reconstructions or replicas would be a lie, and Yasmin called it a joke. Participants further expressed concern that rebuilding the site would be an act of erasure, that its destruction was part of its actual history. Human explained, it's a lesson learned in history. That's a reminder for us that, hey, we failed as a nation and international community. I think that's more important. It has more power than saying we're rebuilding because. When it came to rebuilding methods, participants overwhelmingly favored traditional methods, with 91.9% preferring that the site be rebuilt by hand using original or similar to original materials. Only 2 participants from the Syrian diaspora group, both of whom were between 25 to 34 years of age, preferred the use of digital methods. As Karam noted, it's important that people know about the crime that has happened here. We should not hide the crime that those people did on this place. Many people will. Some people might know that this is not the original, but some might not know. So many participants did express a fear or concern that people would not be able to identify the replicas or the reconstructions versus the original one. When it came to the topic of reproductions, could the Triumphal Arch reconstructions stand in for their original counterpart? 94.5% of Syrian diaspora participants, which you see here represented by the bar chart on the left, said that a copy cannot replace the original object. As Mustafa put it, No, nothing can replace the original. No thing, no one can replace another one. Some participants did concede that a copy would be better than nothing. However, it was with the caveat that a replica could never fully replace the original arch, and many participants wanted there to be some sort of notation, some sort of disclaimer, indicating that the replica was not the original. When it came to the museum visitors, as you can see from the bar chart on the right here, 53.3% indicated that they disagreed that a copy could replace the original object. So either somewhat disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. The combined total for disagree was 53.3% of the sample. 9% felt indifferent about it, and 27% agreed that a copy could replace the original object. So definitely much higher than the Syrian diaspora group. The digital era and the adoption of disruptive technologies has facilitated the circulation of cultural heritage on a global scale. At the same time, regions experiencing conflict have necessitated new solutions for the safeguarding of endangered heritage. Organizations such as the UN have pointed to digital methodologies as a tool for the accessibility and preservation of heritage as a human right. However, technology is not neutral, but entrenched of bias, specific points of views, and intentionalities. Likewise, cultural heritage presents a contested space within which various actors and communities seek to assert their individual authorities, agendas, and rhetoric. The results of this research show that the reconstructed arches were not successful at fulfilling the objectives their makers had for them, at least not in full. Relatively few participants from either the Syrian diaspora community or the public sample were aware of their existence, despite widespread media attention. Even though there was this lack of awareness, individuals in the Syrian diaspora group did express happiness as well as pride over seeing that larger triumphal arch replica as a symbol of their cultural heritage, and they particularly were feeling proud that it was on display to a global audience. While copies may function to keep memories of places and things alive, the data demonstrates that most of our participants did not consider such interventions to be substitutive for the original object or site. Digital copies are incapable, or digitally born copies are incapable of refabricating the intangible qualities that make heritage meaningful. They erase certain histories and privilege others, which may not be the past most significant to the very groups that they purport to help. Such interventions may be more reflective of the actors who enact them, in this case, the IDA. For instance, our interviews found that the Syrian diaspora group associated Tadmor most of Queen Zenobia in the Palmyrene Empire. On the other hand, the triumphal arch, as the IDA's chosen icon, is a palpable reference to the achievements of the Roman, an empire prominent in Western culture. The IDA's replicas embody a sort of sanitized version of history, one of remembering while forgetting. For instance, the erasure carried out by Dash was seen by some participants to be the most important event recorded by the ruins of the site, a tale of the failure of humanity to stop the crimes wrought on the Syrian people, and a powerful lesson for future generations. Returning Tadmor to a version pre-Dash was an unwelcome choice. Therefore, digital interventions need to be handled with care, both in their creation and in their deployment, in order to prevent harm to the very people they purport to help. Syrian diaspora participants felt re-traumatized and outraged by the sense that their heritage was yet again being pillaged and paraded on display for political gain. They expressed a desire for meaningful consultation and partnership rather than a lack of representation. Although participants at both the museum and in our interviews recognized heritage as belonging to all of humanity, at the same time they ascribed the triumphal arch to Syria and the Syrian people. Greater transparency around the process of reconstruction, motivations, and the endgame for these projects would do a lot to assuage suspicions. Ensuring that intellectual property rights and tangibles, so for example, monetary benefits, remain within the community of origin or go back to the community of origin would prevent the perpetuation of extractive and or colonial legacies. As groups are vulnerable during times of armed conflict, the conservation sector needs to be particularly cognizant of the manner in which heritage is saved, however well-intentioned. Cultural diplomacy through digital reproductions may be effective at reinforcing existing alliances, so at the nation to nation or state to state level, and bilateral relations, as evidenced by the numerous photo ops during the Triumphal Arches Whirlwind World Tour. And here you can see a photo of the Triumphal Arch across from the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. The same efficacy does not necessarily translate to the people-to-people scale. In this instance, neither the small nor the big IDA arches were effective at building a, quote, foundation of trust amongst the people, one of the key tenets of cultural diplomacy according to the United States of America's Department of State. Heritage conservation is not immune from the psychological disconnect that problematizes the digital age. Often undertaken away from prying eyes and legislation, digital interventions are often faster, easier, and in some cases cheaper to deploy than more traditional conservation tools. Although digital interventions lend themselves to salvage operations in times of duress such as war, that does not absolve archaeology's ethical responsibility to critically assess such projects, demand accountability, and ensure that certain standards are met. Digital interventions cannot and should not be enacted in isolation, devoid of meaningful and adequate consultation. They must not speak only for the actors who produce and invoke them, but also with and for the communities who may call heritage their own. I would like to end this talk with the words of Rawan Moon, a member of the Syrian diaspora community that we met with. To understand the past, we have to have something that connects us to the past, the heritage, what they left for us, so that's what connects us with them. Thank you.